Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome. Today we're going to do a deep dive overview of Race to Berlin, designed by Krzysztof Dicek and published by Portal Games. In this two-player game that recreates the last months of World War II, one player takes the role of the Russians and then the Germans fighting on the Western Front, while player 2 takes the role of the Western Allies and the Germans fighting on the Eastern Front. The goal is to be the first person to Berlin. Now, this game is a second edition of a much earlier version. We'll talk about some of the differences in the second edition in the video, but this game is coming to crowdfunding on Gamefound in the middle of April 2025. Links are down below if you'd like to check it out. Let's jump right in though and take a look at the game. So I've got Race to Berlin spread out and ready to start play. This game is set up. It's in setup mode with all the pieces on the board. Now, quick caveat, this is a prototype of the game, so some of the quality of some of the components might change, some of the look might change between now and the final version. Just something to keep in mind as we go through this overview of the game. Again, as I mentioned in the preview, this is a two-player game. So one player is going to be controlling the Russian forces behind these red lines here, as well as the German forces on the Western Front. And the second player is going to control the Allied forces, Western Allies behind these blue lines, as well as the German forces fighting on the East Front. The goal, there's multiple ways to win, but the main objective is to be the first side to reach and capture Berlin. Now, gameplay length is listed as 2 to 2.5 hours. And historical length is a little bit abstract, but if we look at where the Western Allies are, this is right about the beginning of March, I would assume. And then Berlin fell early May, so 2 to 3 months you would expect. And there are actually 3 turns in the game. So if we use that similar math, abstract thinking, each turn in the game is going to be about a month's worth of historical action. Unit scale is a strategic level. These are armies and fronts, and there's relatively few units. There's only about 40 or so counters in the whole game, although there are a lot of wooden blocks to facilitate gameplay as well. And we mentioned this also is a second edition of the game, and it improves the rulebook from the first edition. There's also some rules revisions, and some rules have been modified and tweaked to improve gameplay based on feedback from the first version, and then a greatly improved component level from the earlier edition, which was published in 2015. Now, if we touch on just some of the mechanics before we jump in and look at it, logistics plays a big part in this game. We can see here these logistics blocks, and they're going to be placed out on the board, and that's where you're going to be conducting your actions. You never have enough logistics blocks for the places where you want to put them, so choosing where you're going to emphasize your supply for offensives and for defensive actions is very, very important. This also highlights the two-player nature of this game. Game has hidden information. When you are placing these logistics blocks onto the map, each side, generally one player is going to be on one side of the board, and one player is going to be on the other side of the board, and you're not going to be able to see. You'll see where a block is of your opponent, but you don't have any idea what the value is until the player commits it in the course of their turn. So it's a lot of kind of guessing and figuring out where your opponent is trying to push and where they're trying to defend and where you want to push and try to defend. So there's a lot of kind of subtle interaction based on the hidden information on these blocks. Now, as we can see, this is an area movement game. There aren't any hexes. We've got just these larger areas that units are going to be in and pushing through. And you'll also notice we have this very unique system for marking the front line in the game. We can see these red lines on the east side for the Russian forces and the blue lines for the Western Allies. And basically, as you're moving forward, you're shifting these lines and taking areas. And you also have to be a little bit concerned of overextending this front line because the number of blocks that you have is limited. You've got Allies have some extra ones here, Russians have some extra ones, but if you run out, you can't really, you can't extend your front line that way. The last thing to mention is probably the alternating actions of the action phase. So there's each turn consists of 3 phases, and the heart of the game is the action phase where players are going to be alternating actions. So the Russian player will do something with either the Russian units or the Germans in Western Europe, and then the Allies are going to do something with their forces either on the East Front or in the Western Allied forces on the Western Front. And you're going to go back and forth over the course of a somewhat lengthy turn sequence as you play through the game. Let's take a look at the 34-page rulebook. And again, this is a prototype version of the rules, but 34 pages might sound like a lot, but it's important to note that the last pages here, the last dozen or so, 10 or so pages, are all highly photographed examples of play with graphic elements added. The combat system is, and the movement system is not complicated. There are some subtleties to it that you kind of have to read it a couple times and say like, oh, okay, I get it. But a lot of examples really help facilitate that. The rules, again, these will be modified and tweaked, I'm sure, as the game goes to its final version. But the rules I've found to be straightforward and clear. There's a few places I wasn't quite sure, but then as I looked at the examples of play and some of the player aids, I was able to figure out pretty quickly what we were supposed to do. Some notes on strategies here for the forces, then a couple pages on the unique mechanics for Berlin. We'll talk about that and show the Berlin side map as well. And again, as we can see here, lots of pictures, lots of graphics to support gameplay. Not a tremendously dense rule book, even though the rules go up to page 22. If I were to give this a complexity rating, I would give this a complexity rating of a 3 out of 10 on a Wargame scale. I don't think there's any reason to let the complexity of this game scare you off. I think this has a wide audience that can enjoy this game. Let's jump in now and take a look at some of the components, starting with the counters. Normally when I do this, I show the entire counter sheet, but I've already played this game now two-player once, so I don't have the luxury of still having the counters in the counter sheet. So I'm going to show them live and set up on the map. And this will also give me a chance to talk about scenarios and the setup here too. So the setup is fixed. We notice that baked into the map are where these particular counters go. So the 2nd Panzer Army goes here, just to the south of Budapest, as does the 6th German Army on the Eastern Front. And then over here we have some Western, some Russian units here. Units are 3/4 of an inch big, and there are about 40 in total, although there are also some fortress markers, things like this here that represent strong points, defensive strong points, and these gray and white ones function a little bit differently in the game. We'll see how that works as we get there. So there are a number of these in the game as well. And if we hop over to the Western Front, we can see some of the German units here that are Russian controlled. So they have the gray with the red bar on top. And then these blue units, the blue and white units here, are the Western Allies. So we can see the 3rd U.S. Army, 7th U.S. Army, and then the 1st Army, First French Army. I'm kind of zoomed out to show another feature of gameplay here. This is a very low counter density game. There's probably about 30 or so military units in the game. And an interesting aspect of gameplay is the Western Allied forces and the Russian forces don't suffer casualties. So if they lose an attack, they just stay at the same strength. So you're always reducing these German forces. And we should also take a close look at that to see how that works. And we'll notice here for the German units here, they have strength points on the counters here. So 4 across the top. Then when they suffer casualties, they get spun to 3, 2, 1 strength point at the top. And then after this unit would suffer its next casualty, its next loss, it would be removed from the game. So the German units function differently than the Russian and Western Allied units, because the Russian and Western Allied units don't suffer damage. They're assumed to always be at maximum supply and have reinforcements coming in to keep up the press on the German defensive fronts. Focusing in here, let's take a look at some of these front line markers. So these here distinguish the front lines. And say, for example, after this fortress was eventually reduced and wiped out, and these German units would be driven back, say, to spaces in other areas, then these Allied units might move up in here and you would shift the front line. So the front line would go, in this case, up to what we can see, this blue one here is the Rhine River. And so this would shift back there. And again, these blocks are limited in supply. There are penalties if you do not have enough of these. So as you kind of moving forward, you're trying to kind of make sure that you don't want your front lines to get overextended. But what you end up with is a really neat picture of the front line. As you look at it in the game here, we can see it, extends down. You're constantly thinking about how you want to protect your front line, keep it relatively short, and be able to use it, and still at the same time trying to be able to cut off enemy units. Let's take a look at what I think is really the heart of the game system here, and this is the logistics blocks, the dice, and then the action cubes. Now, at the beginning of each turn, the 3 turns, players alternate placing these logistics blocks face up, facing them, so that the numerical side is hidden to your opponent. These are only single-sided in terms of the informational aspect. And it's important to note that these logistics blocks are the attack strength and defense strength that you're going to be using in the combat resolution. So the attack strength and defense strength isn't inherent in the unit, it's inherent in these logistics blocks. So if you attacking, for example, gets more complicated, but say if you're attacking with logistics 5 as the Western Allies against a Western German unit that had logistics 3, basically that's a 5-3, and you have much greater strength in this combat. And how you resolve this is you then, each side rolls 2 dice, and you add the difference in the dice to your logistics value, and that's going to determine the winner. So if this combat here, Western Allies 5
4 and a 2 is a difference of a 2. They would have a final attack strength of 7. The Western Germans would be defending with a 3, and a difference of 1 would be a 4. It would be a total of 7 to 4. The Western Allies would win that combat. Now, it gets much more complicated because you can add action cubes, and if you add 2, you're going to double this value. You can have units behind a river. You can have special action cards that can influence the values that are in there. You can have fortresses in play. And so there's a bunch of things here that can alter this combat, but that's really the heart of the system. And then over the course of the length of the turn, you can only allocate as many action cubes to this logistics block as it's equal to its number. So a 5 is your biggest one, but once you've allocated 5 action cubes over the course of 3 or 4, 2 or 3, 4 actions, you can't do that anymore in that particular turn. So, when you're going to commit a big amount of cubes, 2 cubes to a logistics block, or only committing 1 cube to it to try to use it 5 times, it's a huge difference in how you're thinking. So you're constantly thinking, what am I trying to do? Where do I need to win? Where do I need to double this value? So it's a very, very interesting logistics-based combat system. And we'll see more of this as we dig into gameplay and I start to show some gameplay. As we take a look at the Italian front here, I did want to spend a moment to talk about what I think would be the solitaire capacity for this game. I've played this game 2-player now, opposed, and it was really fun. It's also really apparent as you do that a big part of the game's depth and replayability are those hidden logistics blocks. I mean, that's really a core mechanic, and you don't know where your opponent's going to be placing them each turn, and trying to outguess your opponent and figure out where you're going, as well as emphasizing your priorities in every single turn, is a big central part of this gameplay. So while you can play this game switching back and forth between both sides functionally, this game really isn't designed for solitaire. It's designed for that opposed 2-player experience. I'd give this game a 3.5 out of 10, maybe a 4 for a solitaire rating. A couple of other components to look at. These are victory point markers. There are 4 for each side, and these are location based on the map. There are 4 places on the map that are identified as victory point hexes. The first way you win the game is by capturing Berlin, to be the player that does that. However, if that's not done, it's the player who has the most victory points at the end of the game that wins the game. That's the second way to win the game. And the third way to win the game is if your opponent has a situation where they need to use a supply cube, whether it's by forced retreat or some other action in the game, and they can't use it, you've then forced them into an automatic loss condition. So there are 3 ways to learn and play, but these victory points is that second level of winning. Then this is the very cool turn marker, really high quality components here to kind of facilitate gameplay. The last component-based element to take a look at are these special action cards. So each side has a deck of 8 cards that they refresh each turn in the game. And these allow you to enhance combat or add die roll modifiers to your attacks, or allow you to re-roll, or allow you to obviate retreat. You don't have to necessarily retreat in certain situations. So this one here, for example, here adds +1 die roll modifier to an attack that you're making. This one you can use to re-roll a particular dice roll. If you don't like your attack, you can re-roll the 2 dice and get that again. This one adds an extra logistics power, so it doubles the attacking power if you're on the attack. This one is a counterattack, which obviates the need to retreat after a failed combat and can allow you to stay in place. And then, so there's a bunch of different ones. And again, because this is a finite resource, you're often thinking, when do I want to spend this? When do I want to keep it? Do I need it later? Do I need it now? Where is the critical spot that I need to try to shift this combat because it's a critical combat? Where do I really want to hold my position? Where might I want to reroll? And again, you never have enough cards to do all the things that you want to do. There are 2 player aids that come with the game, one for the Soviets, one for the Allies. The front page here highlights some special rules, and then as we look through these, basically it's a summary of combat, which is very handy to kind of have all of the combat execution sequence in here, because with the special action cards and with some of the die roll modifiers, it's not complicated, but there's enough going on that it's really nice and handy to have it here in one place, as well as, it gives an outline on how you can use these special action cards, and then some special notes on some of the rules around Berlin, which has some nuances as to how you can move units and where units can go and how units attack and defend in that other little mini map. And we'll see that as we take a look at the maps in a moment. Here's a look at our approximately 24.5 inch by 24.5 inch square map, which mostly consists, again, as we can see, of Germany in the middle here. We've got the east front that's clearly marked and the west front that's clearly marked. Really, I like the color here on the map. I love the grittiness of the terrain and the way it looks. It feels like the end of World War II. And I just really like how these front line markers play out in the game. I mean, it gives you a nice visual parsing. When you look at the map, you know exactly the situation as to how far one side's come and which way they might go and things. So just I think a really nice job with this map. Now this is, again, it's a thick mounted map here, but this is the prototype quality, so I think this is going to change in the final version. But that's not all, because up top here we have Berlin, and that's where you're trying to go to. But if you get to Berlin, you actually use this mini map over here. Let's take a quick look at that. And so here is the minimap. Once a unit goes into Berlin, any defending German units that have been pushed back in there go into the heart of Berlin. These two left sides are where the blue arrows mark where the Western allies can go. The right side is where the Russian allies can go. And this is the final battle. So you don't just automatically take Berlin. You actually have to come in, work through this, and then attack the final city here to take it and win the game in that predominant victory condition fashion. There are also some special rules that go for movement and navigation and stacking in here. We'll talk about those as we get to gameplay. Just to kind of bounce back and talk a little bit about stacking and kind of that low counter density. The maximum number of units you can have in an area at any time in a turn is 3, as well as you can never have more than 1 logistics block in an area as well. So again, it's a very low counter density and unit density game, which works really well. It just makes it kind of play very smoothly and play very elegantly. So there we have it, an overview of Race to Berlin. Again, as I mentioned in the interview, this game is coming to crowdfunding on Gamefound in mid-April 2025. I'll put a link down below if you want to follow that campaign or check it out to see if this might be something you would like. To help out with that, I will be following this video up in a very short time with a gameplay video that shows how gameplay works. I'll put a link to that as soon as it's ready. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great day.